The first papal legate was a man who became quite famous, Carlo Borromeo, who worked with the Medici Pope Pius IV to develop a plan for urban improvement, including an impressive new building for the university, built in the city center in 1562-63. Put up very quickly, that building still stands today. In one move, the university was centralized and highly visible and controllable. For centuries, classes had met in different locations in the city. The prestige of the university was ensured in order to attract top scholars and significant numbers of students from abroad. Research, science, and medicine generated the most attention and excitement in this period. Rejecting tradition as a source of knowledge, they developed out of the Aristotelian tradition of natural philosophy new experimental methods emphasizing direct observation as the source of knowledge. So dissection of human cadavers, they had public anatomy theories, all of that is going on and emphasized in this period. One professor came to light in terms of this topic, a man named Ulisse Aldrovandi, who in 1560 was appointed the professor of natural history. He had an encyclopedic interest in plants and animals. He built up a huge personal collection and a network of traveler scientists, ambassadors, with whom he exchanged information. He invited them to Bologna. He went to their place. He developed a museum and library that he opened to scholars and artists for their research. Perhaps what's most significant about Aldrovandi's activities in terms of the hypothesis of a region of complexity is the way in which he remained open to the variety of structures of thought and the organization of material acquisitions that flourished outside the Bolognese territory, which connecting and interacting with the hubs in his city, the university, artistic circles, scientists, the signori or aristocrats and senators, and the papal authority or legate formed this kind of bubbling up of information and new ways of thinking. His activities form one of the many strands of the shifting web that made Bologna a city in ferment in the late 16th century. The other thing that kicks in here is that for the church, it was a period of reformation and renewal. The church's constraints on scholarship were reflected in the strictures of the Index and the Inquisition. So the stance of the papal legate was critical for the Bolognese community. Were they going to be closed down or opened up from that perspective? But fortunately for the territory, the man vested with this authority from 1566 to 86 was Cardinal Gabriele Paleotti, who wasn't originally a Bolognese, who was an important player in the deliberations of the Council of Trent, and one of the few who took seriously the implications of its recommendations for reform and renewal. He was an important player in the last session of the Council of Trent, including the one devoted to reforming religious art, which called for the rejection of mannerist exaggeration and sensuality and the use of pagan figures in religious narrative. The challenge to art of the Counter-Reformation was the call on artists to produce religious art that appealed directly to the faithful through accessible representation. Paleotti was that rare administrator who considered the reality of everyday life in the city, and he worked consistently according to the Trent ideals. Just to summarize here, because I realize I don't want to go over time, he defended the rights of scholars who were questioning the traditional teachings to study, experiment, and report on their findings in the quest to better understand nature. He protected scholarship. In fact, his activities touched on every aspect of daily life for most Bolognese citizens and visitors. He instituted education for children of all social classes. He emphasized the dignity of each individual regardless of their social standing and the like. I think because of this, public life was more vibrant than ever. I talk in a longer paper about the printed matter that was available to everyone in the public. They were like flyers that were distributed, posted. In fact, town criers on horseback, every time a new bando was published or a new proviso with new laws, would gallop around the city to the various piazzas and announce, like a town crier, what was in that, and then they would post them all over the place. There were thousands of these survive, and we can trace the life of the time from them. One particular kind was called an avviso, dealt with news from abroad, a type of early journalism that was very popular, covered news like the Turkish assault on Malta, and the visit in 1585 of Japanese, quote, princes to Europe, and they came to Bologna as well as to Rome, In the Avviso, they described in detail their costumes and habits. One more note, in terms of street activity, a man appeared in 1568 from the outlying region in the Bolognese city-state and took up residence in Bologna as a writer and performer. His name was Giulio Cesare Croce, and he seems to me to be a parallel for what the Carracci were doing. He observed life of the time, and he gave it back in performance, poetry, and literature, stories, in folk tales, back to the people performing in the streets and for feasts at the time. He rejected the artifice that was the staple of current mannerist expression in literature and art in favor of real life with all its humor and pathos. He performed on the squares and in the portici, the galleries that line the streets, and at public and private feasts. I think his poems and stories parallel the Carracci drawings of street merchants, beggars, and families, intimate scenes of mothers and children, very unusual for studies in this period. So, the reform that the Carracci embraced for looking for new models that embraced this style closer to the real did not happen overnight. There are always patrons and artists who remain connected to the traditional forms and reject the new. But the Carracci and their followers were able to develop a new approach to representation, I think, because of this Bolognese context. It was, after all, Annibale who was summoned to Rome in the late 1590s to decorate the papal family palace for the Farnese. And I'm showing you here one of the paintings he did for one of the rooms in that palace, the Choice of Hercules, where I hope that it's a large painting that was put in the middle of the ceiling to always remind the Farnese prince living there of the terrible choices that one had to make in life. The difficult choice on the rocky hill to virtue, or what looks like the easier one to vice and hell, sensuality. Very monumental figures, and going back to really classical ideals with having seen when he went to Rome, not just Michelangelo, but also the collections of classical statuary in the papal museum. So with Annibale, you have a new thrust, actually. Everything that he tried to do in Bologna, he was able to put into place in Rome. So his experience from Bologna bore fruit in what was probably the most important interior decoration of the 17th century because of what it led to, his Galleria Farnese, which is about the loves of the gods. It's not in a church, it's in a palace, so he was able to get away with this. But I wanted to show you how he takes the ideas from the 16th century, from Michelangelo, and his ideals of naturalism, and moves toward a very complex system of decoration where he begins to bring into play a different kind of activity, very different from mannerism. So instead of sinuous curves, you have a kind of torsion of the body suggesting activity. This is the giant Polyphemus, who was in love with Galatea, and who wanted the one-eyed giant. It wasn't her. He's playing his panpipe. At the other end of the ceiling, he is hurling a stone at her lover. But notice what he's done. You have what looks like a painting. This is all fresco, right? What looks like a painting leaning against an architectural system, which is open to the corner. We're looking up at the ceiling. So there is this illusion of a different reality above our heads, and it's extremely convincing, with every feature seeming to interact, whether it looks like sculpture or it looks like a real person. And this had a tremendous effect on the rest of the Baroque period, as did some of his followers. And I brought in just one example of Guido Reni, who was one of his collaborators in Bologna and then in Rome, who was the most sought-after artist in Europe until his death before mid-century. And Guido Reni, who I find is kitsch at its height. It's hard for me to explain why Guido Reni drives me crazy, but he's taken what the Carracci did and frozen it in a kind of representation that really appealed to all the ruling families in Europe. And he did, but he couldn't stand Rome after a while, so what did he do? He went back to Bologna, where not much was happening. And he was able to make all his work. It was sent out of Bologna, but in fact, the high period of Bologna ended when Annibale Carracci went to Rome. And it wasn't just that he left. It was that their systems imploded. So is this the kind of material